Thank you for joining us for this presentation this evening. It is primarily for my own wonderful community here on the Gold Coast in Queensland, but we have invited a number of other friends to join us who have a particular interest in this subject, and also our dear friends in the Ku-ring-gai community, because they had expressed an interest in having a presentation today. So thank you for joining us online, and also to the friends around Australia and in different parts of the world. We're coming together in this virtual manner to recount the remarkable story of Clara and Hyde Dunn, who on this day 100 years ago landed in Sydney, Australia. I will endeavour in an hour to give the essence of their story for the purpose of acquainting the friends with some of the essential outlines of their story and their character. What I propose to do, I think I'll take an hour, after which I will be happy to stay online and entertain your questions. Please feel free to leave, come and go at any time that you need to, but I'm happy to be with you for the next 2 hours. I propose to speak in four sections here. The first is to look at the origins of the Dunn story up to 1920, and I characterize that as a period of formation and tests. I will then look at the period of 1920 to 1934, which is when the most active and vigorous elements of their career in service to the faith took place in Australia. There's a third period, the third and final period, which is characterized by their courage, their endurance, and the rewards of their labors. And that goes from after the formation of the National Assembly until the passing of Clara Dunn in 1960. Having looked at those three periods of their life, I will make some comments or suggestions on their achievements and their legacy. In the first section, I will very briefly talk about their childhood and upbringing, on how they became Baha'is, on their relationship with Abdu'l-Baha, on the manner of their marriage, their acquaintance with the tablets of the Divine Plan, and how it was that they came to Australia. So let us begin with Hyde Dunn, born 1856 in London, the youngest of 12 children. As a young man, he married and had 2 children. We don't know much about this family and marriage, but evidently they divorced. And at some time he migrated to North America. And he was employed as a traveling sales representative for a milk company. He encountered the Baha'i Faith in Seattle in 1905. He was age 49. And we hear that at the moment that he encountered the faith, he had a personal transformation. He gave up drinking and smoking, and that was the start of a lifelong transformation from that period. But in essence, it means that we don't know too much about the first half of Hyde Dunn's life, but we know much more about the second. Now, we know that he studied the Baha'u'llah's teachings through outstanding early Baha'is, including Thornton Chase. You know, Thornton Chase is the first American believer. And Thornton Chase and Hyde Dunn had a strong admiration for each other. Also, Lewa Getzinger, Ella Cooper, Isabella Brittingham, and others were Hyde's teachers. And having learnt of the faith, he became an enthusiastic teacher all along the Western states. This is a story not yet told in print. But he was a travel teacher not only in California, in Oregon, Washington, but also Washington State, but also Nevada. He was a very keen teacher of the faith. Having become a Baha'i, he married. A second marriage was to Fanny Oliver. She passed away in 1916 and is part of the story. The second of these remarkable people in this wonderful marriage was Clara Holder, born Clara Holder. She has a remarkable story. She's born in 1869, also in London, to parents who were English-Irish couple. Catholic Protestant marriage. The family migrated to Canada when she was just a year old. She recounts that it was an unhappy household and that she ran away at the age of 16. She married William Allen Davis in Toronto. And in 1887, she gave birth to a son named Alan. Tragedy struck the following year when her husband was killed in a railway accident. So she was widowed and with a son by the age of 18. She suffered a period of illness, and during that illness, she made a decision to move from Canada to Walla Walla, which is a town on the west coast of the USA in Washington State. She moved there in 1902. And it was there in 1907 she was introduced to the Baha'i Faith by Hyde Dunn. She was aged 37. I'm now going to talk briefly about some things that they have in common. During the period 1905 to 1911, both wrote to Abdu'l-Baha. And in 1912, both met Abdu'l-Baha when he came to San Francisco. Now, I mention this because for a long time, we may have thought that it was only when Abdu'l-Baha came to San Francisco that Clara and Hyde became acquainted with him, or more importantly, that he became acquainted with them. But it's not the case. They had earnestly written to him individually in the years before that. After Hyde's wife, Fanny, passed away in 1916, Clara and Hyde married in 1917. In 1919, the American friends first became acquainted with Abdu'l-Baha's Tablets of the Divine Plan. And it was these messages to the American, or the North American community, that pleaded with them to take the faith to countries that Abdu'l-Baha was no longer able to travel. And you may know the story in which Clara and Hyde turned to each other and said, "Shall we go?" And the answer was yes. They decided instantly that they would travel. And so it was that they started making their plans, and they traveled by steamer, passing through Honolulu for 2 months and arriving in Sydney on April the 10th. Here's one of the letters to Hyde Dunn, 1911, from Abdu'l-Baha. "Thou son of the kingdom, his honour Mr. Chase has given the utmost praise to thy love and thy excellence, that in reality thou art the herald of the kingdom, art giving the utmost effort to the spreading of the teachings of God. Therefore rest thou assured that the Lord of hosts shall send thee the heavenly confirmation, and it is my hope that the Holy Spirit may breathe in thee the breath of eternal life." Friends, I may not read all of these letters in detail. You will have a chance to see them after. It's important to know that they had both received communications from Abdu'l-Baha. Mrs. Brittingham went to Accra and gave a letter on behalf of Clara Davis, as she was. "Mrs. Brittingham brought thy letter and gave thee the highest praise, saying, Praise be to God, that thou art a contented soul, and art happy and confident before God. Thou art a believer and assured, attracted and enkindled. Undoubtedly the confirmation of the kingdom shall descend uninterruptedly, and the assistance of heaven shall encircle, and day by day thou shalt make progress." These letters had a big impact on the lives of Clara and Hyde in ways that I cannot explore in full detail in this brief session. Now, this is from the Sydney Archives, and it's listed as a tablet from Abdu'l-Baha to Clara Davis. So far in the story, which I've told in brief because I want to spend more time on the years in Australia, which is really the subject that we're focusing on, I want to draw your attention to this 14-year period of remarkable activity and achievement. That the Dunns nurtured the first generation of Australian and New Zealand Baha'is. That they established Baha'i communities in Sydney and Auckland and Melbourne and Adelaide and Perth and Brisbane and Hobart. That they established local spiritual assemblies in a number of these places, in Melbourne and Sydney and Auckland and Perth and Adelaide. And that on the basis of these efforts, they were able to form the National Spiritual Assembly for Australia and New Zealand in 1934. Now, this is a remarkable achievement for 14 years of service, and I'll explore it in a little detail as we proceed. When the Dunns were on the boat, crossing the Pacific Ocean, they wrote to Abdu'l-Baha. And Abdu'l-Baha wrote back. They received this many months later. And Abdu'l-Baha said in this letter, "This journey is pregnant with great prosperity because great results will issue therefrom. At present, it is full of hardship, but later on, favor, comfort, and happiness will be bestowed. The hardship of winter shall end, and the comfort of the spring and the freezing wind shall be followed by the life-cherishing breeze of the spring. Rest ye assured that divine confirmations will reach you." They were very, very responsive to the call of Abdu'l-Baha, both in their years in California and in their first years in Australia. I hope I had time to comment on this further detail later. Now, when they arrived in Sydney, they experienced illness and uncertainty. Hyde Dunn was not well. Clara obtained some work. It was at least 6 months before he felt well enough to seek employment. They had very small amount of money available. They knew very few people. They had a few connections. And it was on the basis of those connections that Clara was able to get some work, but Hyde had to make his own connections. This letter is written in July 1920. They arrived April. So April, May, June, July. And he writes to some friends in North America. To find a way of living is the rub, for there are so many labor restrictions and conditions to contend with, but once again, no matter, the covenant of God is watching us and protecting at all points, surrounding us with beautiful friends, so we know the material will work out all right. And there are a number of letters that they wrote back to the North American friends saying, we don't know what door will open, but we are confident that Abdu'l-Baha will find a way forward. They believed firmly that all of the fortunate, what others might say were chance circumstances, were God-created opportunities presented to them to fulfill their mission in Australia. So they're in Sydney 1920 to 1922. And in the years 1920, 1921, 1922, they did not give public meetings. They spoke to individuals, and there were many people attracted to the Baha'i teachings, but no confirmed believers until the end of 1922, when Oswald Whitaker, it comes later, Mr. Whitaker, and I'll show him. But I want to talk here about the manner in which Hyde Dunn was able to both earn his living, and some of you will know this in broad outline, but it went like this. He obtained a position as a traveling salesman in which he traveled to country towns through the week and would return on the weekends. This was in New South Wales. And at the end of a year of working for the company, which was first the Bacchus Marsh Milk Company, and then it was taken over by Nestle, he topped the national sales figures of any salesman. He started the job when he was 65. At the age of 66, there was a meeting with all the sales representatives, and we have this story directly from Mr. Collis Featherston, who told the story many, many times. He would say, would Mr. Hyde Dunn please stand up? And he stood up and he said, congratulations, you have topped the national sales figures. What can we do for you? And Hyde Dunn said, I want to travel to every state in this country. And they said, right. And they allowed it. And it was that means that he could organize himself to spend either many months or a year at a time in Sydney and then Melbourne and then Adelaide and going over to Hobart, spending time in Perth. And that was the method that he was able to earn his living and meet many, many people. Now, here's a letter written in 1923. We've just been here over 2 months in Melbourne. Many meetings have been held, small public talks given. Every Friday night when I return from the outside towns with my wife, we hold a meeting in the home of a herbalist. They are all investigators and the numbers grow. On Sunday evenings, we often speak to 100 or 150 people. Their interest is beautiful and they continually ask for more talks and literature. Last Sunday was the first Baha'i Feast in Melbourne. 27 dear friends came, all full of love. I love that letter. This is a telegram from Shoghi Effendi, 1923. And he says, praying for glorious success in your noble endeavors. I'm sorry, I said 23, but I think it might be a bit earlier than that. But I show you this telegram to bring in the theme that on the passing of Abdul Baha, Clara and Hyde turned that devotion to the center of the covenant once again to please Shoghi Effendi, to observe his requests to them and his guidance, which they continued to do for the rest of Hyde's life, and then Clara did for the rest of the Guardian's life. It was these types of cables that kept them going in that relationship. Now, Hyde traveled with a small typewriter and a traveling bag. And as he was traveling during the week, he would be staying in a country hotel at night, and he would talk to the people who were staying there. There might be fellow travelers selling things in that town. They all had stories. And he would write to inquirers and contacts and friends around Australia and around the world. He wrote to Haifa. He wrote to America. He wrote back to Clara. And it was this typewriter that gives us the small snippets we have of the Dunn's life and what they achieved. Now, the first Australian Baha'is, as many of you know, Oswald Whittaker, we don't have a very good photo of him. We have to work on that. And Effie Baker. Tonight is not the story to tell of them in detail. But they became lifelong friends of the Dunns and assisted him. Oswald Whittaker in Sydney and Effie for a few years before she went to Haifa, where she served the Guardian for 11 years. This is an example of the type of letter. I won't read it to you, but it's beautiful, poetic, full of love. And he wrote hundreds of these letters to inquirers, to newspaper editors, to people around the world. This is an example of Clara Dunn. Clara didn't type, she wrote. And her letters were full of news. And this is an example of where she's talking about Martha Root going to the Holy Land, and that A.P. Baker was going to be joining her. It's in the middle of this letter here. And this is a 1924 letter, because our theme at the moment is these early years. So I'm showing the way that the Dunns communicated was extensive letter writing. And I'm going to show you a little bit more of the technique of the Dunns, of how they taught in a vigorous way. I said this period to 34 is a period of vigorous teaching. Now, look at this. We've got an Adelaide newspaper, January 1921. And it's a letter to the editor about the Baha'i movement. And he had noticed some comments in the Adelaide paper, and he was writing in to give some more details about the Baha'i teachings. This is an example of how the type of activity that his mind was constantly on ways to present the faith to the public. Now here's an item from the Brisbane Courier, 1926, and Hyde started to give public talks. I'm going to circle it here. The Unity Truth Center. Speaker, Mr. Hyde Dunn from California. Subject, Divine Plan of the Ages. And he put hundreds of these in the newspapers. There are hundreds of them. Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Adelaide, Perth. This is the age before the internet. People looked at the newspaper to see who was speaking in town, and they would attend these meetings. This is an example of an early meeting in Melbourne, one of these types of meetings. They weren't all necessarily Baha'is, but they were friends of the faith, sympathizers, inquirers, some of whom became the first devoted early Baha'is. Clara and Hyde at the middle there. This is the first generation of Australian and New Zealand Baha'is, specifically from this period, 1920 to 1934. So many of these have stories to be told. These were the first Australian Baha'i teachers and administrators and treasurers and authors and donors and pioneers, a number of whom became Knights of Baha'u'llah, and many of whom became members of the First National Spiritual Assembly. These were the foundation of our Australian and New Zealand Baha'i communities. Each one has a story to be researched and to be told. The Dunns were so loved by these early Baha'is. And this is an example of a social program, social for farewell to Mr. and Mrs. Dunn, put on by the Melbourne Baha'is and their friends. They made a nice little social program. They made up a little program here, and they had singing and recitation and a little speech. And part of the Dunn's method was to embrace their friends with love and hospitality. And this teapot is such a wonderful, colorful reminder that we only have black and white photos, but it was a vivid, very expressive environment in which the Dunns were spreading their love to these different communities. They became very close friends with Martha Root, who traveled to Australia in 1924 and again in 1939. And this is a photo taken in Adelaide, where she's about to leave on her way to South America and on to Haifa. And Effie Baker's on the left, and Effie joined her. I love this photo. You see Hyde always immaculately dressed. Now, Hyde worked for 12 years, from the age of 66 until about 78. This was the years of the Great Depression. It was not an easy life. He also went on radio. Here's an example from a Hobart newspaper, 1925, and in the middle here, the Baha'i movement. A message of universal peace was going to be on Melbourne station 3AR. You get the idea that Hyde Dunn used every means that was available at the time to get the message out. Now, in those days, the privacy rules were a little different. And when you came into town, you could be in the newspaper. So here's a Broken Hill newspaper, the Barrier Miner for 1932. Mr. Hyde Dunn of Nestle's Milk Company arrived from Adelaide this morning and is staying at the Grand Hotel. And often when the Dunns travelled, this would be announced in the papers, and they would be able to make connection with old friends and new in the hotels as they travelled. This is a photo of Clara and Hyde with the Adelaide Baha'is about 1929. Clara and Hyde there. Now, I want to give a bit of a note. I said that they raised the first individuals and they also raised the first local assemblies. This is a little bit of historical detail here so that you can learn something new. And which is the first local assembly in Australia? It was Melbourne, 9 December 1923. But it was disbanded about 1927. It didn't continue. It was not easy. And it was re-established in 1948. So Melbourne wasn't part of the first National Assembly. Adelaide Assembly was established 5th of December 1924. It also struggled through the Depression years, but it managed by 1934 to be in place to help form the National Assembly. Auckland was established in 1925. It didn't continue continuously, but it was an assembly in 1934 and was the second of the assemblies. I'm looking to see if I put Sydney in there. I missed Sydney. Perth Local Assembly was established July 1924, but later disbanded. It was re-established in 1936 and then re-established again in 1949. But Brisbane and Hobart Assemblies weren't formed until 1949, in a later period. Now, one of the final achievements I noted for this period of the Dunn's life was the formation of the National Spiritual Assembly. And that was in Sydney in 1934. There were only 3 assemblies, were able to send delegates. And that was Sydney, Adelaide, and Auckland. It was the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Australia and New Zealand. The wonderful lady on the far left, her name is Margaret Dixon. She travelled third-class railway to get to the convention. She was a very close friend of the Dunns, and she lived with them at various times, helping Clara with the household and the teaching. For 2 years, she lived with them. Many, many stories inside this one wonderful photo. Hyde was elected to the National Assembly in the first year, but he was now near 80 years of age. You'll note that on the first National Assembly, there were 5 women and 4 men. They do include the first Australian Baha'i, Oswald Whittaker, behind Hyde Dunn, and other wonderful early Baha'is are in that photo. So that was the years of action, 1920 to 1934, in which the Dunns managed to travel around the country and attract sufficient inquirers to the faith who became firm Baha'is and allowed them to form the National Assembly. Once the local assemblies and the National Assembly was in place, the role of the Dunns changed, because they were no longer they were not the institutions. They were the supporters, the mentors. Their role changed. And as you can see, this is the first summer school at Yerrinbul, and Hyde's looking older here. He passed away 3 years after this at the age of 86. He's about 83 in this photo. But note that he still has his bow tie on. He continued to write on that typewriter into old age. And I picked out just one line that don't worry about all of the detail in that. I picked out one line. He's writing to the Perth Baha'is, 1939, 2 years before his passing. He said, "I must not write anymore as the strain is too great. Although it may not show here, but so hard to write when the outer eye can't see words." That's his way of saying that he could no longer, he memorized, he touched typist, but he couldn't see what he was typing. But he taught to the end, and he encouraged to the end. The last years of Hyde Dunn's life were spent in Sydney in a wonderful little apartment in Kirribilli, in a lovely named street called Carabella, 40 Carabella Street, Kirribilli. And this is Clara Dunn sitting. And this apartment actually looks over Sydney Harbour. So the Sydney friends, go for a drive, look for Carabella Street, Kirribilli. And let me tell you something interesting, that when Clara was a new Baha'i, and she suffered a great illness, and she was recovering from that illness, and she confided to a woman who was looking after her named Mrs. Mary Burland. She said that during her illness, she had had a vision, following which she knew that she would get well and take care of Hyde Dunn to the end of his life. She said, "I know his destiny, and I have been spared to care for him." That was written in the memoirs of Mary Burland, I think in the 1940s. When he passed away, 1941, Shoghi Effendi wrote, "He, the spiritual conqueror of the continent of Australasia, will, by his spirit, his example, his accomplishments, continue to inspire the rising generation in that far-off continent and indeed throughout the Baha'i world. The memory of his deeds will shed imperishable luster on the annals of the first century of the Baha'i era." There's more that the Guardian said, and I will bring that out a little later. I want to tell you a nice story about Clara Dunn. I want to know her character. And this is a story that's recorded by Harold Fitzner. Harold and Florence had met the Dunns in Adelaide in the late 1920s, and they became Knights of Baha'u'llah to Portuguese Timor. And from there, Harold wrote this story in 1965, which I'm bringing to you. Once in Adelaide, when Mother was staying at the exclusive South Australian hotel, dinner was being served, and our party of about 5 entered the dining room. Someone mentioned that Mr. Ben Chifley, the then Prime Minister of Australia, was sitting near our table. He was pointed out to Mother, who immediately stood up and said, "I should like to speak to Mr. Chifley." She then walked across to his table and addressed him. "Good evening, Mr. Prime Minister." Mr. Chifley immediately stood up and, looking at Mother with her sweet smile, he bowed very courteously and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I do not remember you, madam." Mother stood very straight and said, "The name is Clara Dunn, and I represent the Baha'i World Faith. You do not know me now, but you will hear of me one day. Good night, sir." Mr. Chifley stood until she was seated again. It all passed off very nicely, we thought. Mother was unpredictable, and no one ever knew what she would do next. Hyde Dunn passed away in 1945. Clara's service continued another 19 years until November 1960. She travelled around Australia. Here she is at the establishment of the Woodville Local Assembly in 1948. And, you know, we have Margaret online with us tonight, and her father, Hand of the Cause, Collis Featherson, sitting in the left there. Not in the chair of the meeting, but to the left. Once the National Assembly was established, they started to have systematic teaching plans. See, previous to that, the Dunns could decide based on where they were. They made the teaching plans. When the National Assembly was in place, they made teaching plans. Shoghi Effendi encouraged them to be more systematic. Clara Dunn offered her services as a travel teacher or a short-term pioneer. She spent many months in Brisbane. She was even in Newcastle. She spent more time in Melbourne, Adelaide, in Sydney. She kept traveling. In 1952, she received this cable from Shoghi Effendi. "Moved convey glad tidings, your elevation, rank, hand cause. Stop. Appointment officially announced, public message addressed all National Assemblies. May sacred function enable you enrich record services already rendered faith." I'm looking at this period, 1935 to 1960. Hyde Dunn was appointed Hand of the Cause posthumously after his passing by Shoghi Effendi in a communication. And Clara Dunn was appointed Hand of the Cause in 1952. Although now of quite an age, she continued to travel both in Australia and other countries. She traveled to the New Delhi Conference, which is one of the major conferences at the commencement of the World Crusade, and we'll see a photo shortly. In 1954, she appointed the first auxiliary board members in Australia, and that's Collis Featherson on the left and Thelma Perks on the right. Her 2 trusted advisors who assisted her in her onerous duties as a Hand of the Cause in this part of the world in her very senior years. When Shoghi Effendi passed away in November of 1957, Clara Dunn insisted on taking her rightful place at the concave of the hands in Haifa. It was a massive effort for her to get there and to get to some of the meetings. But she was able to sign the messages and agreements of the Hands of the Cause that started the 6-year period of the Ministry of the Custodians. There were a number of processes that Shoghi Effendi had already set in place which continued after his passing. And one was the construction of the Baha'i House of Worship in Sydney. She attended the foundation ceremony. She supported Yearable summer schools. In the 1940s, she even served on the Sydney Local Assembly for a number of years before she started her travels. And as I mentioned again there, for many, many years, she traveled around the country, supporting communities, being supported by her friends as well. Here we have a photo of Mother Dunn in New Delhi. Hand of the cause, Mr. Khadem on her left. Hand of the cause, Collis Featherstone, although he's not a hand at this time, but he's down to the left. And Margaret, if you could just confirm, did she go with Ethel Dorr to New Delhi? Maybe you can put a chat about that. This is the international conference, the first major conference, Baha'i conference in Australia.
You talk now.
Hello?
Yeah, Graham.
Yeah.
What did you ask me?
Oh, Margaret, I was just checking to confirm who travelled to the New Delhi conference with Mother Dunn.
It was Mrs. Bowes, Marjorie Bowes.
Marjorie Bowes, thank you for that. Thank you. Of course, I did know that.
No, I'm sorry. No, she took him. No, she took him to Haifa for the conclave.
Yes.
In 58.
I was just checking.
In 57. Yes, it was Ethel Dorr who's sitting next to her.
Thank you.
Yes, correct.
Yes, thank you. Okay. That's important to know. Ethel Dorr is an unheralded heroine of the Australian Baha'i community. This is 5 hands of the cause: Mr. Khadem, Clara Dunn, Agnes Alexander, Mason Reamy before his defection, Collis Featherstone. And for the keen historians amongst you, you will see that next to Collis Featherstone, to his right, is Effie Baker, with the grin on her face and the beret on her head. But I won't digress further with the stories of who's in this photo, or I'll talk about Greta Lake, I'll talk about Frank Wiss, I'll talk about so many other wonderful people. Joy Khan, I can see Joy Veradsky, I can see a young Featherstone in the front row, I can see Thelma Bergs. Don't get me started. This is at the laying some soil from the castle of Maku in the foundations of the Sydney Temple, with Mother Dunn presiding there. Now, friends, I'm going to move, with apologies for being so quick to go through the story, but I didn't want to take more than an hour of your time tonight. But I do now want to turn to some thoughts on what are their achievements and their legacy. And I've identified 9 subjects. The first is their confidence in and obedience to the covenant, which was clear from their immediate decision to travel to obey Abdu'l-Baha's call, but then also once in Australia to assist Shoghi Effendi in any way that was required to get this Australian community established. Secondly, and this is something for us to really contemplate for into the future, they successfully conveyed the Baha'i teachings in Australian society. This society at the time in the 1920s and 30s and 40s was steeped in racism and religious sectarianism, increasing secularism, materialism, economic turmoil. Some of those conditions still apply, but they attracted so many people into the Baha'i community who became firm Baha'is and themselves then went out and contributed to the establishment of other Baha'i communities around this part of the world in the Asia Pacific. There's much more we can learn about their method of conveying the teachings and how they spoke and their manner and the intensity in which they engaged in their service. Thirdly, they worked as a united team, and there are very many letters in which they speak of each other's service and the ways in which they complemented each other. The fourth is that they advanced both the spirit and the form of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. They understood that it was not a matter of simply having teachings for a new age, but that those teachings needed to be harnessed into the administrative order so that there would be a clarity of purpose and and a method of decision-making going forward. And the reason this is in here, and I haven't had time to go into detail, there were 1 or 2 times when Hyde Dunn had to take it on himself to request some people to leave communities when he felt that they really didn't understand the faith completely. And he did that, and then Keith Ransom Cayley did a bit of that as well in 1931. Because there were, in the 1920s, people around the world who saw the Baha'i Faith as spirit, the Baha'i movement, and we're not so keen on the administrative order. But without the administrative order as a vehicle, the spirit had no manner to be channeled through. The fifth is that they studied Baha'i literature and followed developments in the Baha'i world. Now, what I mean by that is every time there was a new book produced, Hyde Dunn was writing to the publisher, whether it was North America or Europe, and getting copies, not just for himself, multiple copies. And there are still copies in the archive that have his name on it and say, property of Hyde Dunn, please return, because he shared his books. And so it's a prevailing theme, recurring theme, that they, in their letters, I've showed you a few letters, they'll often say, have you seen the latest essay by Shoghi Effendi? Or have you seen the wonderful book by Esselmont, Baha'u'llah in the New Era? But in addition to studying Baha'i literature, they also studied world affairs. And Hyde was particularly interested in labor conditions and relations between capital and labor and fairness, because he was in the business world. He was very concerned about the condition of capitalism and the future of profit sharing. Now, the seventh, which I've indicated slightly, is that they prepared their teaching campaigns meticulously. They were not the type of travel teachers who went to a new city and hoped for the best. They were the type of travel teachers who wrote ahead, made connections, connected with the newspapers, found out which organizations in town had public meetings, joined organizations, supported campaigns for justice. We find that when there were some tragedies overseas, it might be a famine or a flood, that the Dunns would be on the committee, the Lord Mayor's flood appeal, the Sydney Lord Mayor's flood appeal for victims of floods in Europe. And Hyde Dunn will be on the committee. Eighth is that they demonstrated extreme compassion for others throughout their years. And it was instilled in them by the harshness of their own early years, their childhoods, their adolescence, their early adulthood, that they understood the conditions of people's lives and the need for compassion and non-judgment. And again, there's a wonderful passage from Harold Fitzner that I will share with you in a moment. And the ninth is that they overlooked their personal shortcomings and relied on divine assistance. They had very little resource. They were already of middle age. They both had health conditions. They were not people of vast book learning. They hadn't gone to senior college in any way. They'd gone to basic schooling. And they set aside all of these limitations to mix at all levels of society, from the leaders down to the most humble. So I've identified 9 areas in which I find that their lives are exemplary for us. Now, Harold Fitzner wrote, many people have asked us how Mr. and Mrs. Dunn taught the faith. And we would say in answer to this question that they taught by their lives, by example, by their good deeds and by prayer, and through the power of the holy words of God. They were always kind and lived simple and holy lives. They never refused help to anyone. All their spare money went in helping others, trying to save men from the drink curse, bailing people out of prison, giving clothes to the poor, and providing food and housing when necessary, calling on sick people and praying for them, consoling bereaved people who had lost a dear one, and many other acts of charity and kindness. This is how they taught the faith of Baha'u'llah. I mentioned to you that they were a solid unit working in harmony. And as early as 1926, before all these victories, Hyde had written to one of his good friends in Sydney, one of the Baha'is, Ernest Brewer, who was an editor of a newspaper in Sydney. The work of this servant has always been pioneer work among people in some way. God uses me and causes hearts and souls to listen and to be attracted. Then Blessed Mother, she gives many finishing touches with her precious love. God causes her to diffuse the love of the covenant in the hearts of the investigators until they become firm and steadfast. God, in his mercy, ushered us into marriage, that we might serve as a team in his blessed cause and pioneers in this country. This is very moving for me, knowing that this is before the victories were in place. It's the certitude with which Hyde Dunn approached his task. I'll leave the last words to Shoghi Effendi. I have a couple of short passages to share. He extols Hyde and Clara Dunn in God Passes By. He refers to Hyde Dunn as great-hearted and heroic. He says the great-hearted and heroic Hyde Dunn, at the advanced age of 62, promptly forsook his home in California and seconded and accompanied by his wife, settled as a pioneer in Australia, where he was able to carry the message to no less than 700 towns throughout that Commonwealth. There were more intimate expressions from Shoghi Effendi. There are a number of these, and I've only picked out one. Shoghi Effendi wrote to Hyde Dunn many times through the 20s and 30s, expressing his admiration for the work they were doing. He wrote in 1935, I am truly distressed to learn of the illness of so precious, so dearly beloved a worker, so magnificent a pioneer in the field of Baha'i service. I hasten to assure you of my prayers at the holy shrines for the recovery, the welfare, the success and happiness of one who may be truly said to have set an unsurpassed example to the generations that will be called upon to serve the cause of God throughout the whole world. My gratefulness to you knows no bounds, and my affection for you is beyond description. I have read many letters from Shoghi Effendi to Baha'is around the world, and this is as intimate as he could get. After Hyde Dunn's passing in 1941, Shoghi Effendi wrote to the National Assembly, the community, the most great name in those far-off islands, has lost a great leader, a stalwart upholder of the New World Order of Baha'u'llah. The influence he has exercised will, however, continue to live, and the example he has set will inspire the rising generation to perform deeds as great and brilliant as those which will ever remain associated with his name. Our dear friend Mr. Hyde Dunn will, from his exalted station, intercede on your behalf, and you should, on your part, strive to emulate one whom Baha'i historians will recognize and acclaim as Australia's spiritual conqueror. I will pray for his dear spiritual children from the depths of my heart. So we come to the end of this brief presentation through the actions of Clara and Hyde Dunn. The roots of the Australian Baha'i community were planted in the heroic age under the guidance of Abdu'l-Baha. These roots were nurtured in the first epochs of the formative age under the loving guidance of Shoghi Effendi in the hands of the cause and the Universal House of Justice. It's thrilling for us to see the achievements and the legacy of Clara and Hyde Dunn being appreciated and discovered as we face the challenge of advancing the faith of Baha'u'llah in this country into its second century. In what ways do we now strive to emulate their example as exhorted by Shoghi Effendi 8 decades ago? I did invite Mariette Leong to be part of it tonight, because she, amongst us, may be the only person online who knew Mother Dunn, and she has given some wonderful presentations herself. And so thank you, Mariette, for joining. If there's anything you wanted to share tonight that would add to the presentation, we'd love to hear it.
Yes, I knew Mother right from growing up, really. She was in our house from the time I was born, and she visited us on many, many occasions. And I have a lovely photograph of her of sitting on her lap. I have a photograph of myself and my siblings. We did a dress up, and we're standing in the garden with Mother. She was like I guess, a grandmother to us, a grandmother figure. And we loved her dearly. And in 1953, you know, it was the Indian Intercontinental Conference in India, which Mother attended. And my parents went. And being a family of 4 at that time, myself and my siblings were all shipped out to our cousins and aunties and uncles and so on. I went to stay with my auntie and uncle. And I have a beautiful letter from Mother in which she wrote to me, and she said, "You be a good girl for your auntie and uncle, and you make Abdu'l-Baha happy, and you do everything that will make your mummy and daddy happy for when they come home." So, I mean, Mother just didn't write to adults. She wrote to small children too. And then in 1955, she wrote to my sister Kay, and Kay came across this letter. Kay is 7 years older than me, and she came across this letter, and she said to Mariette, "Do you remember receiving a box of chocolates from Mother?" And I said, "Oh, I can't remember. It's too long ago." She said, "Because I just found this letter amongst a whole pile of other things." She says, "I just found this letter which reminded me that Mother wrote to me in 1955 saying, please tell Mariette that I'm sending her something via her daddy. But the problem is that at that time my father was on the National Assembly, and he used to visit once a month for NSA meetings, and so he would see Mother at Toolang Road, Paddington, where the National Assembly was having their meetings. And she would give him little gifts for us. You know, she would make little dilly bags of lavender, which she would take from the garden. She would dry it and make a little bag that you could put in your clothes drawer to make your clothes smell nice. She would give us chocolate. She would give us a handkerchief and little things that she had made and so on as little gifts. In return, we would send things back to her. Well, this time she was sending a gift for my father. But she said, tell Mariette her father came flying down the stairs thinking that he was going to miss his plane, and everything went out of my head. And so I'm going to enclose the handkerchief. This handkerchief is for Mariette. But as for the chocolates, she said, I'm afraid I ate them myself. So I didn't get the chocolates. She got to eat them. You know, one time when Mother was not well, we went up. She was staying with Mr. and Mrs. Bowes, and she was in this lovely big double bed with pillows and cushions all around her. She had her lovely blue dressing gown on, and we were all seated in a circle around the bed saying prayers. And we said our prayers, and somebody at the end said, "Have you got a prayer book?" And Mother said, with her eyes closed, she said, "You can't take a prayer book with you." So in other words, learn to memorize your prayers. And then on another occasion when Mother was sick, and we thought that maybe, I mean, she was already 88, and we thought, oh, maybe she wasn't going to get through this. And we were saying healing prayers and so on. And we got to the end, and she still had her head down with her eyes shut. And then she opened one eye and she looked at everybody and she said, "I'm still here." So she had a wonderful sense of humour. She had a beautiful laugh, and she had that spiritual joy and glow, I think, that attracted people to her. And I'm assuming that Father Dunn had that glow too. You know how when you really see spiritual people, I mean, they had nothing. They had no material gains in life. You know, when Father passed away, Mother had no money to support herself. The Baha'is supported her. And I remember when she went off to Haifa in 1957, you know, for that conclave in Haifa, she didn't have clothes that were suitable to wear overseas. And so she was staying with us at the time, and my mother went into Maya and David Jones and bought up like a suitcase of clothes on credit and brought them back to the house. And Mother tried them on and decided what she liked and what fitted her best and what was suitable, and then my mother returned the balance. And so that's how the friends took care of her, looked after her. There was this beautiful camaraderie in the community. I think because we were small, we all knew one another, and we all dearly loved Mother. So, you know, it was a beautiful spirit that we had in the community at that time. Not that we don't have that spirit now, but it's different now because our community's a bit bigger.
Hi Graham, it's Farron. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to see this happening, especially I'm sitting here with my son, and I think the first time he's hearing the full history, and that's I think inspiring for a lot of the youth as well. I was just wondering whether you didn't go into detail in many of these individuals who became Baha'is, etc. Would it be possible, you know, while we're sitting home these days, we've got nothing else to do, maybe continue with a series of these things if you have time?
I'd be happy to do that. Happy to do that. Thank you, Farin. Friends, this happened tonight because of Farin. He made a suggestion to his assembly that I make a presentation, and we couldn't do that tonight. But it was inspired by their interest in the subject that we have come online tonight. So thank you to Karingai Assembly for that, and thank you to Farin. I'm happy to have these history nights where we talk about all those other wonderful souls. There are so many wonderful early believers that we know nothing about. And, you know, just a little bit of sadness that I think, 100 years and we didn't really get to know Clara and Hyde Dunn until we got to a centenary. You know, it's, you know, let's appreciate these early pioneers who, you know, if you move into an assembly that's got 50 or 60 people, well, someone set that assembly up. If you have some sort of legal recognition from the government, if there's messages that come from the Prime Minister of Australia, well, that's because it started back in the 40s when they sent messages to prime ministers that were just completely ignored, and slowly built up an awareness of what the Baha'i Faith is, so that now that the Prime Minister now says, you have made a great contribution to this country. You see, there's a continuum here. If the Dunns hadn't done what they did, and then those other wonderful early Baha'is didn't do what they did, then we wouldn't be here now. So this is the God-given time and opportunity for us to reflect and learn, and then reflect on how we go forward in the next 100 years in this country, because we happen to be living here, the new age, new technology, but the same problems, the economic problems that he faced. You know, one little irony is that they were meant to arrive in Sydney on April the 9th, but they needed a health officer to go out to the boat and check that everybody was clear of some bug that might have been picked up in Pango or something. And so it messed the historians up a little, because the newspapers were printing that they'd already landed. And but it was because of health quarantine that their boat stayed in Sydney Harbour for another night.
Graham, can I comment two things?
Yes, please, Anna.
Is that when we went through the archives, we've seen a lot of letters from Father and Mother Dunn that have been written to a lot of Baha'is or non-Baha'is.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I want to share a story. When was it? It was a couple of years back when we had that celebration where Peter Khan came and presented in Sydney. We were looking for items to find, and we found a small envelope that inside the envelope there was a small note with some petals of flower and a brochure with a picture of Father and Mother, I think it was only Mother Dunn, that was given as a gift by Father Dunn to Mother Dunn on their anniversary or something like that. Maybe Satu would remember it. And I did a scan of those things, and it would be in the archives. And there was this envelope, a small envelope with a brooch with a picture of Mother Dunn in it, and a small note as a gift to Mother Dunn as a presentation to her. So it shows that they were really beautiful couple.
Thank you, Ahmad, for that. And friends, Ahmad in Sydney has many years been working with the archives and helping to organise them. So thank you for that information. I'm currently transcribing as many letters as I can. So for finishing the book on the Dunns, which is overdue. So that eventually we will learn more and more about the. There's just so many stories, more stories that we could tell.
Graham, I've got a question. Just wondering if the Dunns had engagement with Indigenous Australians and to what extent, please.
Yes, I've been asked that before. There's very little direct engagement. There is, in fact, the only engagement that I have know of is a photo when they were crossing the Nullarbor by train, and Clara Dunn has a photo with an Aboriginal woman. But you know, in the 1920s, these societies were so separate, and we don't have any evidence of interaction. It came in the 1940s and 50s, and that is a wonderful story of how the Baha'is around the country started to have very effective friendships with Aboriginals from the late 1940s, which the story hasn't been told. But your direct question of the Dunns and Aboriginals, I've been looking for it and I haven't found it.
I have a question.
Right, Graham, thanks.
Yes, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk. Just a question about some of the characteristics you highlighted in Australian society that were so at odds with the teachings, with the Baha'i teachings. Have you come across any material about how this was impacting the Baha'is, or how they, you know, how did they deal with that? That, you know, the contrast of some of the Baha'i teachings with what society around them was saying.
Well, part of the answer is that the community grew very slowly, and it was, you know, the generality of Australian society was quite racist, and quite wedded to a lot of traditional ideas, and it was very difficult to find people who broke free of that. But when they did find them, those early Baha'is were just absolutely so solid, so, you know, so firm in the covenant once they became Baha'is. So, I mean, your question's really excellent. And I think it's the heart of understanding how the Dunns managed to do what they did when others who came after them didn't have the same success. I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks, Graham.
Yeah. Thanks, friends. Just to see if there's any other... yes?
So many people here. I'm wondering whether there's anybody else that has met her. If they have...
Well, I was going to see if Michael Smith is still online.
Well, my grandparents became Baha'is they lived in Lismore in 1947. And Stanley Bolton Sr. was a chiropractor, and he had a practice in Grafton. And my grandfather was a banana farmer, and he had a terribly bad back. And he would travel all the way to Grafton to see this chiropractor. And then Stanley Bolton taught him the faith. He declared, my grandmother followed. And within a few years, they taught their neighbours, and they had the first assembly in Lismore. And we were just going through their visitors book and Mother Dunn's letter. We've got some letters from Mother Dunn, and they had signed the visitors book, and many of the hands had visited this place, Mr. Frutai, Mr. Fazy, Mother Dunn. And then also around the same period, my wife is Marriott's niece. So her mum was Joan Nee Featherston. So they were taught the faith by, I think, Effie Baker, who was taught the faith by the Dunns. So our spiritual grandparents on both sides, Mother and Father Dunn, and it's just every day I think of them. Every time I go out teaching, I live in a neighborhood, in a focused neighborhood, so they're with me every day. I'm so grateful to them, so incredibly grateful to them, because without them arising to obey the tablets of the divine plan all those years ago, there's no way, I know myself, I would never have found this faith. And my children, my wife, my whole being is due to this sacrifice that they made. And I'm just so eternally grateful to them.
Michael, thank you for that. I would love to be in touch with you to see if I can get copies of those letters.
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
Please. Now, look, I notice David Hassall is online, and I know David Hassall has a story about Hyde Dunn.
Hello, David. Well, I believe that Hyde Dunn travelled to Ungary in New South Wales in 1925. Ungary is a little village in the middle of New South Wales, and the doctor there was Dr. Phil Daniel. He was married to one of my relatives. He was married to a lady who was a Hassall before she got married. And so Hyde Dunn met Dr. Phil Daniel and told him the Baha'i story, and he was so enthralled, he went out and got his wife, Laura, to come and listen to the story also. Obviously, his surgery was in his own house in Ungary, and they corresponded then with the Dunns. The Daniels corresponded with the Dunns for several years, quite a few years after that. They considered themselves to be Baha'is. We only found this out by accident one time when we were living in Randwick community, in the suburb of Kensington, and an old lady turned up at our door out of a taxi, and it was another distant relative. That was Laura Daniel, as a very old lady. She'd heard that we were Baha'is. She came to tell us how she and her husband, Phil Daniel, the Dr. Phil Daniel, had been Baha'is years and years before. And he was high up in the Masonic Lodge. And Shoghi Effendi said that you couldn't be in the Masonic Lodge and remain as a Baha'i, because the Masonic Lodge in some parts of the world was a secret society, I believe. So Phil Daniel evidently chose to remain. He became very high up in the Masonic Lodge. But it was, for us, from a family's point of view, it was fascinating to think that actually our relatives were actually thought they were Baha'is. They believed themselves to be Baha'is. Incidentally, Phil Daniel, I was born there in that little village of Ungary. That's where I was born. And Phil Daniel was the doctor. And so I've got an emotional connection with the whole story. I'm trying to find out more about where they lived and what happened and so on. And there is a book, by the way. I was going to see if in the archives, one time I was in the basement of the temple, one time when there was turmoil and there were lots of things stacked around the temple in the basement, books and building materials, all sorts of things. And I picked up a book. It was on top of a wardrobe down there. It was a wardrobe out of a bedroom, that sort of thing. What was doing in the basement of the temple, I don't know, but there were some books on the top of it. And I picked up this book, and in the side, the cover of the book, it said, there was handwriting, it said, this book was given to Dr. Phil Daniel by Hyde Dunn in Hungary in 1925. And so I just remembered that in my mind. I put the book back, but I've often wondered, was the book still in the archives and what happened to it? So I wish it was in the archives. I hope it's found.
A sense of humour. Now, look, I want to tell something about, we talked about how there was just something about the person of Hyde Dunn, trying to understand what it is he attracted people. You know that Effie Baker was the first woman to become a Baha'i in Australia. And if you've read her story, she says this. She says she decided to go to a group called the New Thought, which was an up-and-coming sort of philosophic group. And she said to her friend Ruby Beaver, she said, look at that man in the audience, what a light he's got on his face. And then the next week, he happened to be the speaker. And she said, well, I must listen to what he has to say. And he gave the 12 principles. And he always started with a passage from the Baha'i writings and a prayer. That's far in answer to one of your questions, I think. He wasn't afraid to bring out the spiritual nature of the faith. Sometimes we think in Australia we've got to talk about just the social teachings, the progressive nature of the social teachings. But the Dunns they would use prayer and excerpts, not long excerpts, but short ones. And he had an early translation of Baha'u'llah's writing from Hidden Words. And he said, to look into all things with independent eyes. And Effie, immediately she said to herself, well, I grew up as a Christian and I never thought about it. I never explored it. And she said she immediately went after that talk and declared herself as a Baha'i to Hyde Dunn. And that was the impact of there's something about his ability. Now, how many times do you hear a teaching story like that instantly? We know that when he went to Auckland, he had a group of believers within a week. In Melbourne, in Adelaide, he had an instant rapport with a whole group of people. They didn't all become Baha'is, but those who did, they became very, very solid Baha'is. So there's something about, and you can't, this is to do with the spiritual stature of the man. This is what we're trying to grasp with Clara and Hyde Dunn. That these, Shoghi Effendi tried to put into express in words the elevated station that this couple had achieved in their spiritual understanding of the faith that we strive for, but they attained it, and the achievements are there. I can't express. I don't know how to put that into words, but they had a potency. They had a potency in the way that they the connection that they made with people's hearts. I have a story. He went in. He used to go into chemist shops. They sold formula for children's milk, etc. And the chemist said, "No, go away. I'm too busy." And Hyde Dunn left the chemist shop upset. And then he stood for a moment. He said, well, that's wrong for me to be upset. I'm just going to wait. The chemist was busy. I'm going to wait. And so he waited until the chemist shop wasn't busy, and he went in again. And he said, look, I don't want to sell you anything. I just want to be your friend. And this story is told to me by Thelma Perks in 1981. And she said this man became one of his best friends, but also a good customer. But it was that ability to turn that sort of anger or humiliation or frustration and completely disregard it and go back to that primary teaching of love. I mean, it's very hard, isn't it? When we get turned away by somebody, and then to completely just turn around and embrace that person. That's the type of man Hyde Dunn was. That's what we're trying to understand here, that depth of capacity that, is a dream for me at least.
Graham, I've got something to say here too,
Okay.
which I'm not sure if you're aware, or I'm sure you are aware. Baha'u'llah wrote a quote where he said, should they attempt to conceal his light on the continent, he will assuredly rear his head in the midmost heart of the ocean and raising his voice proclaim, I am the life giver of the world. You know, when Mr. Kardem gave a talk, he said that Shoghi Effendi had said that the Dunns had fulfilled that prophecy because of the Dunns coming to Australia, and now during the 10-year crusade, the Knights of Baha'u'llah opened up the Pacific. And so the whole Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific was all open because of the Dunns.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us online, and we look forward to doing this again sometime. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you,
Graham.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.